Hey, how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Truth Defender podcast. We are coming to you from the greatest country in the world, deep in the heart of the Lone Star State, Dallas, Texas. I'm your host, Paul Aguilar. Really appreciate you guys stopping in. If you guys are watching us on YouTube, please make sure that y'all subscribe and hit that bell icon so that you don't miss an episode in the future, as well as give us a thumbs up as well if you guys like the episode, or a thumbs down if you don't. That'll really help us out as well with the algorithms. Also, if you guys are on the go and you want to catch the show, you can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, as well as iHeartRadio at Truth Defender Podcast. If you want to follow us on social media, you guys can find us on Twitter at Defender Podcast, Instagram at Truth Defender Podcast, Facebook at Defender Podcast. We do have a Discord as well, which will be linked down below. You can find us on PayPal as well if you guys are feeling generous and want to help us out with the hardware and software of everything. You can go ahead and donate there as well. We'll be linking that as well down in the description. If you guys have any questions or comments for myself or our guests, if you have any guest or topic recommendations, you can email us at thetruthDefender1776@gmail.com. Today's guest is Mr. Larry Arnold. Larry Arnold was trained in the methodology of science with an undergraduate major in mechanical engineering. He later worked for the private sector in electrical engineering. In 1976, he founded ParaScience International. As director of PSI, he combines his scientific background with investigating and describing the intriguing world of Forteana, those unconventional subjects and weird events that fail to find acceptance, let alone explanation, within the boundaries of today's science. Larry is internationally recognized for his pioneering research in spontaneous human combustion. Without further ado, Mr. Larry E. Arnold. How are you doing today, sir?
Hey, greetings, Paul. Delighted to be with you this Halloween day.
Absolutely.
If you and your listeners are in for something spooky, macabre, bizarre, and horribly frightful, you got the topic.
Absolutely.
Spontaneous human combustion is very, very strange.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we jump into that as well, can you please let everybody know your background and kind of how you got started on this topic in particular?
Sure. You gave a good introduction. Our background is in science, mechanical and electrical engineering. And then in the late 60s, we started to get interested in kinds of things that fell outside of the construct of, mainstream scientific thought and engineering pursuits. When we were in junior high school, we read a book called Stranger Than Science by Frank Edwards. And in that book, he had one chapter devoted to incredible incinerations. And it dealt specifically with one lady whose name was Mary Weiser. And he claimed that she had succumbed to this strange thing called spontaneous human combustion. And we would talk about that subject with our teachers later in college, with our professors, and nobody knew anything about it. So when we decided to leave the engineering profession in the early 70s and turn our attention and interest to more paranormal subjects, we were called back to what we read in junior high school. We went down to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. to see if we could pull up any original research pertaining to this alleged case of Mary Hardy Weiser, who succumbed very unusually in St. Petersburg, Florida back in 1951. Had Frank Edwards made up this story, or had he reported something that actually had happened? And what we discovered was that he got his facts straight. There was a major newspaper coverage of Mary Weiser's transition back in 1951 that seemed at the time to be incredibly bizarre and unusual. Captivated our interest further, we thought we'd spend a couple of weeks to see if we could find any other cases that were like Mary Weiser's, or whether this is a one-off weird thing that, albeit very strange, did have a prosaic conventional explanation. What happened was that few weeks of research turned into 4+ decades in a lifelong pursuit of tracking down weird stuff, particularly unusual pyrophenomena. It's been quite an adventure.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you even have a book out as well. Can you let everybody know where they can actually find the book?
The book is available through Amazon. The book is Ablaze: The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion.
Right.
You can also go to our website, ParaScience.com, and email us at shchappens@gmail. If at the end of this discussion with your listeners, they want to know more information about this amazing, bizarre subject, the book is regarded as the definitive research project on the topic. email us, and it's a benefit to your listeners, an incentive to get the book and learn more about it. Through the end of 2020, we'll offer to anyone who subscribes or requests the book through your program, Paul. First edition signed copy, we'll sell it and ship it for $10. That's an amazing value.
Awesome.
This on Amazon for $24.95.
Absolutely, we really appreciate that. Yeah. So everybody, I actually have ordered a copy, so I'm waiting for it off of Amazon as well. So I'm going to be reading that as well. So I got that on the way. But absolutely, we're going to be linking the website. That's ParaScience.com as well. That'll be down in the footnotes of this episode. If you guys are watching us on YouTube, you can find it there. Also, if you guys are watching, or if you're actually listening to us on Spotify or any of those, you might want to get to YouTube and actually watch the video, because we're going to be showing some pictures of like actual cases as well, that you guys would want to, or probably have to look at, to kind of understand what's going on as well. But yeah, if you guys are listening to us, please actually jump over to the YouTube channel and watch this when it becomes a video. I'll have this out tomorrow, which will be Halloween day. I'll have it out maybe about noon on Halloween day for everybody to have for the night. So you guys can listen to that as well. But yeah, I guess the first thing we'll go ahead and do is actually get an explanation or a definition of what spontaneous human combustion is.
That's an excellent place to start, because we always like people to know exactly what's being discussed, so there's no ambiguity or uncertainty about this. This is how we define the subject. Spontaneous human combustion is the process, the phenomenon, whereby a person's body will begin to blister, smoke, or otherwise burn in the absence of a known identifiable external burn agent or heat source. So people burn up all the time. In America, sadly, about 2,500 to 3,000 people a year succumb to fire fatality injuries. Most often drop cigarette. Perhaps it's a murder arson case where an accelerant is used on the victim's body to exacerbate the combustion of the body. Those are sad cases, but they're not unusual. They're not mysterious. What history has defined as spontaneous human combustion, or what we prefer to call it now as sudden human cremation, we still keep the acronym SHC,
okay,
is defined historically where the body is almost wholly incinerated to powder. And that's what characterizes SHC in the historical record. That's the concept of spontaneous human combustion, or sudden human cremation.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to add something in there.
Yeah. Burn injuries can be caused by chemical burns, exposure to open flame combustion. It can be caused by contact or near proximity to a radiant heat source. Burns can be caused by electrical injuries, lightning, for example, of course, and also by radiation. Those are the 5 categories that fire science will recognize as capable of producing a burn injury to the human body. If you can rule out those at a fire scene, then by default, you have to look at something that's unconventional. And if the body is wholly incinerated, as are the cases that we're going to be sharing with your audience tonight, Paul, then by definition and by default, and with an open mind, one needs to consider the probability, at least, if not the possibility, of spontaneous human combustion.
Right. Yeah, it's so, like, in preparation for this as well, everybody that I had seen that had done any kind of investigation work or even looked at this topic, has this kind of, I guess, idea that it's somehow not real. So like everybody that I had seen, they're always like, well, maybe they fell asleep with a cigarette in their hand, or they got struck by lightning, or just some kind of crazy idea. Like, why is it because there's just not enough evidence to kind of really pinpoint why it happens that, all these people say things like this?
That's a wonderful question, and it's one that we've pondered for decades now. When we began our research, the data that we've accumulated in those 40 years of researching this phenomenon did not exist. There were 1 or 2 cases. When we began our research, Mary Weezer's flaming fatality was the best known case. So there wasn't a lot of data to work with. And because these fire scenes are so bizarre and so atypical of what professional firefighters and arson investigators expect to find when they're called to a fire scene, it raises so many questions. It poses such an intense conundrum to them that for many people we've discovered they'd rather not think about it. They'd rather decide in their mind that maybe we can just shovel it under the rug, so to speak, the ashes,
Yeah.
and call it just a third-degree burn. Um, can't do that anymore.
Right.
If you have an open mind and you really want to understand one of these amazing fire scenes that we've documented over the years, you have to consider something else. Um, if you if your mindset is so locked into xenophobia, or that I'm an expert and I know everything there is to know about fire, and we've had professional firefighters say that to our face, then you're acknowledging your ignorance of the process of combustion,
Right.
whether it's human combustion or just combustion in general. There's a lot yet that science, fire science in particular, does not yet understand about the phenomenon, the behavior, the nature of combustion and fire itself. Though in human, between spontaneous and combustion, and you've just set off a lot of people who don't want to deal with the concept because it raises so many new questions and tests what they think they know about fire science. And that's what we found ourselves over the years.
Right. Yeah. And you know, when you speak about firefighters, I actually have a best friend of mine since I was a kid. He's actually a fireman down in Harlingen, Texas. So when I had brought up the topic the other evening that you were going to be coming on, he was just like, I didn't even that he had heard of it, but he just never thought that it was a real thing. So I was like, well, you know, we're gonna see, right? But just the fact that he's actually a fireman, he's actually heard of it, obviously, but he just, I guess he had just never seen anything of the sort like in real life, and he just thought that it was just kind of a made up thing. It's just kind of odd. So I mean, how, I guess from, we can think of it like a span from 2000 until now, how many cases do you think get reported every year that actually fit the criteria of SHC and not something along the lines of like them falling asleep with a cigarette in their hand, or, you know, things like that? Like, what are the numbers that we're looking at? Because I would guess that it doesn't happen every year, like all the time. Obviously, it doesn't happen too often, but you know, what are kind of like the numbers that we'll be looking at?
We're going to answer the question this way. It appears from our research that the phenomenon is somewhat cyclical. We get more cases in certain years. A lot of years will go by when we can't find any cases that fit the concept of spontaneous human combustion.
Right.
Going back to the 1500s to date, we've cataloged about 500 cases that fit the concept, that seem to meet the definition of sudden human cremation. Given how many cases there were known to the public when we began our research back in the early 70s, that's a huge number. That's a big increase.
Right.
But given how many humans were alive in those several centuries, you know, the odds of this happening to any particular individual are incredibly small. And we stress this in all our appearances. This is an extraordinarily rare event. And that's one reason it's so easy for mainstream fire science to dismiss it. We're delighted that your colleague has at least heard about it and seems to be willing to have an open enough mind to think that it's a possibility. When one of the cases we're going to be discussing with you tonight happened in Philadelphia. And after we met with the fire photographer and the fire marshal and the fire chief and the assistant fire chief involved in that case, we drove a couple miles down the road to Philadelphia, Center City, Philly, where we had some other cases that over the years had alleged occurred within the city limits. And we showed up and met with a senior fire instructor that day and said, we have these names, these dates, and could you please pull the fire files for us? We'd like to investigate them. He said, well, I can't do that. And our first thought was, well, obviously, why? He said, you know, we're thinking, did they move their records? This is a brand new firehouse in Philadelphia. Maybe they moved their records off site to somewhere else. We'll go there.
Right.
He said, no, what you're asking about doesn't exist. So therefore, I can't have any records for you to look at. And we put some of the photographs that were going to be shared with you tonight, the cases, on his desk. And we said, look, you're the professional firefighter. You're the investigator. You're the fire scenes. What would you do if you got called out to a fire call and you walked into one of these fire scenes, how would you handle it? What would you do? Explain it to us. We're here to learn.
Right.
His response was this: we shall never forget it. "Quote unquote, I'd go out, I'd get drunk, and I'd forget about it." At
Yeah.
which point we were told to pack up our stuff, and he escorted us to the sidewalk.
Mm.
Unfortunately, that's the mindset that we've encountered many times in the years that we've tried to investigate this phenomenon. On the other side, converse to that, fortunately, we do meet with fire professionals who have either had firsthand experience at these remarkable fire scenes, or they have a mind that is sufficiently open and curious that they're willing to look at the evidence and say, wow, this is something we truly do not understand. I want to know more. That's the mindset that we need, that all of us need in dealing with all kinds of paranormal phenomena that happen day after day, year after year, century after century.
Right. And I can't imagine, I mean, obviously I'm not them, so I wouldn't know. I've never held any kind of position within the fire, like I've never been a fireman or anything like that, but especially at the top levels. But I don't understand why they would feel like they would need to, I don't know, not investigate it. I mean, could it just be lack of interest, or they're just lazy, or they just don't want to open a whole another can of worms? Or, I mean, you would think that they would want to know like what exactly is going on. I just can't see like why wouldn't you want to do anything of the sort? Like, why would you want to keep it secret? I mean, it's not going to affect them in any kind of way, I wouldn't think. It's just odd that they just wouldn't want to know anything about it. Or is it, I guess it just doesn't happen as frequently, so it's just not like a big issue. But it's just mind-boggling in that way. It's weird.
It's bumfuddling to us too. It perplexes us. It frustrates us at times. We're here to document the cases, and then to try to understand how this phenomenon happens. Is there a single mechanism, a single set of factors that have to be involved in all the cases? In which case, because people die from this phenomenon, can we do something to safeguard lives in the future?
Right.
Is there some scientific insight that all of us can gain by studying these cases and trying to understand them further? If questions remain after you study and look at the evidence that we've amassed, we're perfectly happy with that. Believe us, there's a lot of questions that we still have about this phenomenon, a whole lot of questions.
Right.
Conversely, though, if you just want to block it out and say, this is too weird, this is too disturbing, this is so disconcerting that I just can't mentally cope with it, that's okay too. But then don't lie about it. Just acknowledge that this is something I just can't cope with and let somebody else deal with it. But we have dealt with cases where literally the evidence has been swept under the rug. We have dealt with big name professional scientists in this field of fire science, forensics, who have falsified data, who have lied about their experiments to explain this phenomenon away. And that's a whole nother ball game.
Right. Yeah. And I guess I should rephrase that. So, I would say the guys that are in the firehouse on the ground doing the work, I'm not saying that they would want to cover anything up. Like you said, the scientists and the people at the top, maybe those are the ones that just don't want to have anything to do with it. But I'm sure obviously all the guys it's like on the ground, they would want some kind of answer as well. So we're not trying to throw any kind of shade at those guys. But like you said, it's just those other people at the very, very top that just are trying to keep some kind of, I mean, they just wouldn't, if it was something like aliens or something, that's different, right? It's something you would want to keep secret or whatever. But like, this is just something that affects people and it's real and it's not coming from anywhere that we can see. It's not like the government's not going out and zapping people that we know of. But like, it's just something that's so mysterious and it's just happening on its own. Like, why would you why would you want to just cover it up?
all excellent points. And because it is so infrequent, and because it has largely been regarded in the fire service community and across medicine and all aspects of science that deal with human biology, as a superstition, as nonsense, as something that's made up. When first responders get to one of these remarkable fire scenes, they're ill prepared to really grasp what they're looking at. And sometimes they've told us that their job is to put out a fire. And if there's not a fire to put out, they pack up their hoses and go back to the firehouse and wait for the next alarm to come in. Um, and that's how they view their job, and that's perfectly fine. We met once with not only a fire chief, but also the owner of a crematorium. I only know one person who has those twin careers
Right.
wedded together. And obviously, we're really interested in meeting with him because he has expertise in what's involved in trying to cremate a human body under scientific conditions, as well as being a professional firefighter. And when we met with him, sat down and shared with him our research, he was astounded. He had no idea that a human body could burn up to the extent that the cases we will demonstrate and show with your audience tonight can do so on their own in the environment in which they incinerate. And this is a gentleman who, as we said, cremated bodies for a living. And as a professional firefighter, he did not know that these cases could occur outside of a retort, outside of a crematorium.
That is crazy that someone would hold those two professions back to back like that. But yeah, it's certainly it's an odd thing. Obviously, I mean, I've heard of these kinds of cases since since I was a child. It was just never like enough information out there to actually look into things like that. And it's crazy. But I mean, we're gonna go ahead and jump into some of the cases here, so we can do that so everybody can get a good look at it. But like I said, if you guys are listening on Spotify or Google Podcasts or wherever you guys are listening to us on, you need to jump on the video on YouTube so that you can see these as well. Obviously, you're going to want to have some kind of context as well. So go ahead and do that for us there, and so you can see what's going on. So we're going to go ahead and jump on in here. Let's take a look. All right. So we're looking here. Okay. So we're going to go ahead, and if you guys can you see the screen there, sir?
We can. Yep.
Yeah,
That's
okay.
the book, Ablaze, The Mysterious Fires of Spontaneous Human Combustion. Details chapter by chapter, many of the cases that we're going to be sharing with your audience tonight, Paul.
Okay.
A lot of the cases never appeared in print anywhere prior to the publication of our book. It's several hundred pages in length. It's got some photographs in it, not as many as we would have liked, but initially the publisher didn't want to print any photographs. And we said, how can you do a book on this subject without photographs? So they are there. And we guarantee that if you get this book, you're going to be learning things about fire and about human biology that you did not know prior to reading this book. There is unique first-hand information in this book that was only obtained because we traveled the world looking for these cases and talking to the first responders who had intimate first-hand knowledge of these amazing fire scenes.
Right. Awesome. Okay. Yeah. So like you mentioned, you guys can find that on Amazon if you're looking for it. And you can also go to his website. He's gracious enough to give us that offer as well. If you guys can get that book sent out to you guys. So go ahead and do that as well. We'll have the website linked down below as well as the Amazon link as well in the show notes for you guys. So we'll go ahead and jump on to the first one here. Let's take a look.
Okay, this is a great place to start. This is what a normal severe human fire fatality looks like. You can make out the contours of the victim. To the right side of the photo is the victim's head. Then the raised part is his shoulders, going down right to left would be his torso, and the legs on the left side of the picture. This is a whole house structure fire. And yet, even though the building burned down around the victim, providing a tremendous amount of fuel loading, the victim's body could be picked up, transported from the fire scene to a morgue for autopsy. Some of the debunkers of spontaneous human combustion have written and have told us face to face that there is no case known in which internal organs of the body are destroyed more completely than our outer portions of the body. That particular quote is from Mark Benecki, a renowned forensics biologist. There's another investigator or another scientist who has studied the effects of fire in the human body, which is toponymy. And she says that even in the most severe burn cases, she could find evidence of stab wounds or gunshot wounds, if this was a murder arson event. In a case like is on the screen right now, you could certainly do that. You could find evidence of gunshot or blunt trauma force injury or stab wounds because there's a significant portion of the body left.
Right.
Keep this in mind as a conventional fire fatality and contrast that with some of the cases that we in Paul are going to be showing to you soon.
That's crazy. It's definitely, it looks pretty brutal. So you
Yeah.
did mention that the entire house actually burned down
Yeah,
as well?
this is a structure fire.
Okay.
And firefighters, this is part of their macabre gallows history, but a person burned to this extent they call often a crispy critter. And this is actually a 4th degree burn. When we began our research back in the, our interest in fire back in the 60s, there were three categories of burn injury, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. 1st degree burn is simply reddening of the skin. 2nd degree burn is blistering of the skin. And at that time, 3rd degree burn was anything more severe than a blister. There is now a 3rd and 4th degree burn injuries, where 3rd degree burn is damage to the skin and the nerve endings beneath the skin. 4th degree is currently the most severe burn injury categorized by mainstream fire science. And this picture would demonstrate a 4th degree burn injury where the burning is deep into the muscle tissue. But again, the body can be picked up, transported to a morgue, autopsy before internment.
Yeah, you would think that for something that would burn so hot and so fierce, for it to actually burn the structure around, that there wouldn't be anything left of the body. But yeah, that's crazy that it's actually still there. Yeah, wow. Well, jump on to this next one here.
Okay, this is Mary Weiser. This is the case that got us interested in the subject under discussion. And synchronistically or coincidentally, depending on one's state of mind, the remains of Mrs. Weiser, who grew up in Pennsylvania, which is our home state, her remains are buried in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, beneath that red granite monolith, about 12 miles from our office here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Though a native of Pennsylvania, she had recently moved in July of 1951 down to St. Petersburg, Florida, apparently expecting to retire there, but she didn't like the heat and humidity. So she was preparing to come back to her home state of Pennsylvania. She came back, but in a way no one would have expected it to happen. Back in July of 51, she was living in this building at 1200 Cherry Street Northeast in St. Pete, Florida. Her story begins or ends, actually it doesn't end, it's still ongoing, but for the discussion under review right now, Mary Hardy Weiser on the morning, she was seen the evening of July 1st, 1951, about 9 p.m. By her son, who was a physician and apparently good health. She was going to take 2 Secondol sleeping tablets to help her go to sleep. She was living alone in an apartment building at the time. The following morning, Western Union telegram messenger arrived with a telegram to be given to Mrs. Weiser, probably giving her the specifics that she was looking forward to take her back to Pennsylvania. No one responded to Mrs. Weiser's apartment knocks on her door. The telegram messenger went down to the other end of the hallway to deliver the telegram to Pansy Carpenter, who was Mrs. Weiser's landlady. Pansy went back down the hallway to knock on the door. Without an answer, she went to just simply open the door and discovered to her astonishment that the door handle to Mrs. Weiser's apartment was hot to the touch. She screamed. 2 painters who were walking across the street heard her screams. They rushed over, broke down the door, and when they went inside Mrs. Weiser's apartment, they found something that has been described as macabre beyond belief.
And we can show that here as well.
Mrs. Weiser's remains, the chair in which she was known to be seated last, and an end table beside the chair were all consumed to a few pounds of ash and rubble. The remains of Mrs. Weiser's body consisted of 1 foot, the satin slipper that ensconced that foot, a few pieces of calcined vertebra, a piece of liver, and that dark ovoid mass at the top of the photo was described by first responders at the time as her head that had shrunk in size, variously described as the size of a teacup, grapefruit, baseball. There was no other significant fire damage in the apartment whatsoever. The investigators started using words like bizarre, macabre, weird. These are not adjectives that normal fire investigators would use at a normal fire fatality scene. Certainly this scene looked very different than the one that we showed you first, in which the entire structure had burned down around the victim. The damage in Mrs. Weezer's apartment was limited to a circle of about 3 feet in diameter. Stacks of newspapers outside that diameter were intact. Bedding nearby was unsinged by the fire. There was enough heat generated in the apartment to melt candles, so that when the first responders arrived, they noticed that the wax tapers had melted through realistically, almost Degas-like, dolly-like, over their candle holders.
Right.
To our knowledge, there was no fire damage to the ceiling above Mrs. Weezer's chair. First responders also said that the aroma in the apartment was quite sweet, which again is atypical for a fatal human fire scene. Firefighters have repeatedly told us that when they respond to a fire fatality, the odor of burned human flesh is quite noxious.
Right.
That was not the case here. It so happened that back in 1951, vacationing in St. Pete at the time was Dr. Walton Marion Krogman. He was a renowned forensic anthropologist who had worked with Eliot Ness back in the 30s and had made part of his career the study of the effects of fire on the human body. Dr. Krogman, vacationing in St. Pete at the time, got wind of the fire, took a personal interest in it. We've had the privilege of meeting with Dr. Krogman, and we discussed this and many other cases with him. We want to share with your listeners exactly what Mr. Krogman had to say about this fire that he initially found so bizarre and so atypical and so mysterious. In fact, he called her the Cinder Woman and said the case was macabre beyond belief. What perplexed Dr. Krogman, and remember, he had expertise in the effects of fire in the human body. He found these 7 conditions problematic in the case of Mrs. Weezer. One, he said, was the extent of reduction to the body. Mrs. Weezer, on the night of July 1st, weighed about 175 pounds. The morning of July 2nd, she and the chair and the end table combined weighed about 8 pounds. Significant destruction of mass. It's a diet that Jenny Craig would never recommend to her clients. That's a tremendously significant weight loss. Another point that so mystified Krogman at the time was the apparent localization of what he thought had to be tremendous heat. In a crematorium, bodies are exposed to about 22 to 2400 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 to 90 minutes. And then the temperature in the retort is reduced to 17 to 1800 degrees for another hour, hour and a half, depending on the weight mass of the body. Yet what comes out of a retort oven at that extreme temperature for that duration of time is not powder, but bone fragments, which are then put in a cremulator, fancy name for a grinder, so that the ashes that are eventually given to the next of kin in an urn are actually mechanically ground down to get that fine powder. That does not happen inside a retort by itself. And yet in the case of Mrs. Weezer, that seemed to be the case. Crematorium operators spend a lot of money on a lot of equipment to accomplish that goal. $100,000 will put you in business as a crematorium operator. But to do an individual cremation requires about 40 or 50 gallons of fuel oil or a couple million cubic feet of natural gas. And we've given you the time parameters and the heat range for a normal cremation. In the case of Mrs. Weezer, Dr. Krogman had to fall back on his experimentation of what kind of heat and duration was required to burn a cadaver to the extent that Mrs. Weezer was burned. And he wrote, and he told us that in his experiments, to replicate the amount of destruction that Mrs. Weezer presented to him and to the first responders would require cremation in a retort at 3000 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 hours uninterrupted.
Wow.
That's extraordinary, given the fact that most house structures rarely exceed 1700 degrees Fahrenheit. So rock that comes out of a volcano, molten lava, That happens at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're talking extraordinary heat here. And yet almost everything in Mrs. Reese's apartment, aside from her body, her chair, and the end table, was intact. This was not a whole structure fire that Mrs. Reese died in. Other things perplexed Dr. Krogman. He said it was the time element that was available. As we said, in his experiments, to burn a body to that extent required for him 12 hours in a crematorium. The most time allowable for Mrs. Reese to burn to the extent that she did was 11 hours, but more likely it's much less than that. A clock in her apartment had stopped at 4:20 a.m. Mrs. Carpenter was awakened about at the same time as something that at the time that she was not able to identify. So we suspect that the incident in Mrs. Reeser began about 4:20 p.m. And again, her body was discovered about 8 a.m. that morning. So 3.5 hours is probably the maximum time allowable. Contrasted that with the 12 hours that Dr. Krogman required in his retort. There was also, to Krogman's amazement, the absence of the noxious odor that we've already talked about. In Mrs. Reese's case, as we said, there was a sweet smell present to the first responders. There was that damnable shrunken skull. This should not happen in a high heat fire. If the first responders identified that item of her remains accurately as a skull, human skulls in high heat don't shrink, they explode.
Right.
So this is another problem. But we have found, since we began interested in this subject, we've found 2 other cases where the skull has shrunken dramatically in size. So as bizarre as that sounds, and frankly, it's extraordinarily weird. This is not a unique situation with Mrs. Reeser. Dr. Krogman said that this whole fire scene to him was an affront to logic and to common sense. It just belied everything that he thought he knew about the effects of fire to the human body. And he did admit that he knew of some other cases that historically sounded similar to this, maybe a few of them. He simply did not realize at the time just how many similar cases there were in history similar to Mrs. Reeser. In the end, Krogman was faced with the conundrum of how to explain Mrs. Reeser's fire scene. He said, frankly, in his years of working as a forensic anthropologist, he thought it wise to declare that nothing is impossible, regardless of how bizarre the facts are. Improbable, yes, but not impossible. So Mrs. Reeser for Dr. Krogman back in 1951 was definitely improbable, but not impossible. And this is the case that launched us on a career.
It's definitely amazing that for her to get down to that, it would require such heat. You would think that the entire building would have came down as well with everything in the room. It's almost kind of like a flash, like a flash burning of some kind that just kind of hit, and then she was just gone along with the chair and everything else. But it's definitely
it leaves you scratching your head. If this is a conventional oxidation type fire combustion, we should be seeing a lot of heat damage. We should have seen the entire structure burn down around her, and we don't see that. We should not be experiencing reports of the sweet aroma present at this fire scene. Right. There's just a whole lot of stuff about the Reeser case that, in our view, certainly doesn't make any sense at all within the construct of conventional fire science.
It makes even less sense, even far less sense to me. So
delighted to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump on to this next one here. Let's take a look.
This is our favorite, because this is what convinced us that we weren't deluding ourselves. We weren't jumping off the deep end.
Right.
By the way, one of our critics has called us a mystery monger, and mystery mongers don't have to do a lot of work to create a mystery. Just make up some facts and throw it out there. And in this day of fake news, right. It's easy to make up stuff and throw it out there and see what sticks to the wall. This is our file on the Reeser case. It's over an inch thick. Right. If we're a mystery monger, we're not going to go to this extent to confab something that doesn't exist, to write it off as fiction. This contains photographs, correspondence, case histories. We've spoken to one of the 2 firemen who shoveled her ashes out of her apartment. We spoke to the St. Pete police officer whose first day on the job was to stand as security outside the Weiser apartment to make sure that the fire scene itself was not contaminated. Both gentlemen told us that they had no clue, and their colleagues had no clue at the time as to how to explain what happened to Mrs. Weiser. And in the case of Nelson Aders, one of the two firefighters who shoveled her ashes out of the apartment, he told us that he believes the best explanation for her demise is simply spontaneous human combustion. Now, Dr. Bentley. This is a case that we discovered, documented for the first time, and brought to the public's awareness back in 1976. This is the opening 2 chapters in our book Ablaze that deals with Dr. Bentley's baffling burning. This is the case that convinced us, as we said, that we were really onto a new mystery. This was no longer superstition. This was no longer going to be written off as fictional fabrication. There was really something going on here.
Right.
In December of 1966, Dr. Bentley was a 92-year-old retired family physician living in Coudersport in Potter County, which is in the northern tier of our home state of Pennsylvania. He was known to be alive the night of December 4th, 1966. His nurse had come and checked on him, and his daughter-in-law, whom we later had the privilege to interview, confirmed that normally Dr. Bentley would have been up and about as late as perhaps 11 p.m. or midnight, any night of the week. When he was last seen, he appeared to be in very good health. He was partially invalidic. He had broken his hip many years before, and he used an aluminum walker to help him move about his 2-room apartment in this house, which is at 403 North Main Street in Coudersport. It's still standing, but in better condition now. But this is what the house looked like in 1966. It was then a tinderbox of an environment. If there would have been any kind of significant fire inside this structure, the whole building should have torched itself to the ground.
Right.
This picture was taken after the fire scene was discovered inside, so clearly the house withstood whatever happened inside. Here's where the story gets really, really interesting. Monday morning, December 5, 1966, shortly after 8 a.m., Don Gosnell, a local meter reader for the gas company in Coudersport, walked to Dr. Bentley's front door, opened it, walked down the hallway to read the gas meter in Dr. Bentley's basement. Walking down the hallway, Don Gosnell noticed a sweet smell and a bluish-gray haze in the hallway. Didn't think a whole lot of it, went down to the basement, read the gas meter, and then as he was preparing to go back upstairs, he noticed in a corner of the earthen floor in the basement was a pile of ashes about 14 inches in diameter, about 5 inches in height. Mr. Gosnell was not only a meter reader, but a volunteer firefighter in Coudersport. He walked over to the pile of ashes, kicked it with his work boot, looked overhead, and above the pile of ashes in the basement ceiling, he noticed a hole in the basement ceiling about 2.5, 3 feet in diameter, with some cherry red embers on its perimeter. Mr. Gosnell told us when we interviewed him later about the case that he thought first that something had obviously burned overnight in Dr. Bentley's home, or had burned recently, but he was curious as to why the fire department in itself did not get a fire call to come out and respond. Went back upstairs, and before leaving the apartment to go to the next house to read its gas meter, he knocked on Dr. Bentley's door to make sure the 92-year-old physician was, okay in the morning. Did not get a response. Being in Coudersport in 1966, people didn't lock the doors. So Mr. Gosnell opened the door to Dr. Bentley's 2-room apartment to peer in to make sure Dr. Bentley was okay. Didn't see the old doc. Walked through the living room, sitting room, and peered into the other room of Dr. Bentley's apartment, which was Dr. Bentley's bathroom. And when you pull up the next image, this is what Don Gosnell discovered the morning of December 5, 1966. Gosnell told us that first he thought he was looking at the leg of a mannequin until he bent down and looked at it closer and realized that half of one leg was a human leg, and that the ashes in the floor below that he had kicked just moments before were the ashes of a body, specifically Dr. Bentley. He told us he wished he had never seen this scene. He ran out of the house, down the street, and into the gas company's office, yelling the understatement of 1966, Dr. Bentley's burnt up. Indeed, Dr. Bentley had burned up, but more accurately, he would submit he did not burn up, he burned down. He burned down through the linoleum flooring. He burned down through the wooden substrate below the linoleum. He almost burned through 3 oaken beams below the floor, and his ashes fell to the basement below. And yet, given what we said to you, Dr. Krogman determined had to be necessary in a crematorium at 3,000 degrees for 12 hours to completely incinerate bone to dust. There was no fire damage to the ceiling above where Dr. Bentley augured his way through the bathroom floor. We were at this fire scene. We were confirmed that there was no fire damage above the point of incineration. Furthermore, you will see some blackening on the edge of Dr. Bentley's bathtub, soot particles, carbonization. The heat was so minimal that the paint on the bathtub did not blister. This was not baked enamel, this was paint. We chipped paint off that bathtub. The paint, though blackened, did not blister. Dr. Bentley's aluminum walker that he used to locomote back and forth in his 2-room apartment did not melt. If you look very closely at 2 of the legs in the aluminum walker, the rubber tips are still on those 2 legs. They are intact. As Don Gosnell told us, there was a sweet, redolent, perfume-like aroma at this fire scene. Again, atypical of human fatality fire scenes. When word got out and colleagues of Don Gosnell arrived to the fire scene to investigate themselves, he warned them not to go in. He said, "You do not want to see this fire scene. Please don't go in, it's too disturbing." As he described what he saw, they did not believe him. They had to go in and see for themselves. We have multiple eyewitnesses to this fire scene. This was never fully reported. In fact, if we reach over here, I don't know if you can get it. Here we go. This is a copy of the front page of the Potter Enterprise for 2 days later, Wednesday morning, describing headline on the front page, the untimely death of the hometown physician, Dr. Bentley. The article is really interesting for a number of reasons. Skeptics of SponCom say that Dr. Bentley, known to be a pipe smoker, must have lit a match and dropped it on his lap in his living room, or dropped the pipe on his lap and caught his clothing afire, and that was the external source for the combustion that consumed his body. Lots of problems with that. Let us explain why we see the problems as for what they are. The newspaper report says that, and we got this from the editor himself who was at this fire scene. He noticed that Dr. Bentley's pipe was placed in its holder on a stand next to the chair where Dr. Bentley spent most of his life. If Dr. Bentley had carelessly dropped his lit pipe on his lap and ignited his nightrobe, it's incomprehensible to us, almost total destruction of the body. And yet, if you look at what was reported officially on the record, there are even more questions that are raised about how Dr. Bentley died and how it was reported. And this is another problem that we find in trying to research these cases. Quite often the medical records, the accounts attributing or describing these fire scenes are themselves inaccurate and not trustworthy. In Pennsylvania, a death certificate is by law a document that is obligated to legally report the accurate details of a person's death. We have Dr. Bentley's death certificate. It says Dr. Bentley died by asphyxiation. Not possible to determine because there was no trachea, no lungs left to autopsy. You cannot make that decision honestly. The death certificate also says, concurrent to death by asphyxiation, there was a 10 to 90% burning of the body. Also not true. As the deputy coroner, John Deck, told us, he would characterize this more like 99% burning of the body.
Right.
We'll accept that.
Ah.
We wish an accurate, honest autopsy would have been conducted. Clearly, it was not. Dr. Bentley, in our view, is the quintessential poster boy for the historical concept of spontaneous human combustion, or as we prefer to call it now, sudden human cremation. Very localized fire of apparent intense heat, and yet beyond that 2.5 by 3 foot hole in Dr. Bentley's bathroom floor, no evidence of the expected heat whatsoever. There are just so many conundrums, so many paradoxes about this fire scene that people who see it are either left scratching their heads, as happened with one senior fire instructor down at the National Fire Academy in Emmitsburg, Maryland, when we showed him this photograph, or you are confronted, as we have been confronted, with naysayers who just refuse to accept this as a true historical document or something that they don't want to accept as possible. We have been told that this photograph is photoshopped. Well, it was taken in 1966 before Photoshop even existed.
Right.
We know the provenance of this photograph. We will stake every penny we have in our bank account and every penny that's in the national debt, which is huge, that this is a real historic, bona fide photograph depicting a real historic event, unaltered. This is what Don Gosnell saw when he entered Dr. Bentley's apartment the morning of December 5, 1966. This is not photoshopped, and it is not a hoax, and it is not fake photography. All those charges have been made of this photograph. None of them are true.
Right. Oof. No, it's definitely odd. I mean, like you mentioned, nothing else burned. I mean, the walker's still there. I mean, besides the hole in the floor, it's everything else is still there. I mean,
everything is pretty much there except 99% of Dr. Bentley's body. This is his legacy to the world of medicine and to the world of fire science today.
That's rough. Yeah.
It is rough. It is rough. It's no wonder if you've been a firefighter and you've been to a few fire fatalities, you don't forget them. They're very emotionally disturbing fire scenes to begin with. But as the first photograph showed, and as we've tried to explain, you expect to see a whole body, or pretty much a whole body, that can be picked up, removed from the premises, and if need be, autopsy.
Right.
There's nothing here to autopsy. Truly, there isn't.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing that I thought of at that time was he probably went into the restroom for something and then it just caught a blaze and then he fell over. That's what it looks like, right? But it's
that's our interpretation too. We believe that Dr. Bentley got up from his chair in his sitting room and was responding to a call of nature and just didn't quite get the task completed.
Yeah.
He was walking to the toilet and this is where he met his flaming fate.
It's a rough way to go. You just hope that for them it's instant. I mean, they don't have to like lay there and feel every second of it until they're gone. But
this is probably why some fire professionals find this such a horrific consideration. They know that contact with an open fire source can be very painful.
Yeah.
And people who have survived, stove accidents or scalded themselves when they flipped over a pot of hot water. Yeah, burn injuries are very difficult to live through. They hurt. Reconstructive skin grafting itself is very painful and time consuming and not at all pleasant. So the initial response to a fire scene like this is, my God, this guy must have suffered immeasurably. How awful it must have been. Our belief is that these episodes, for Dr. Bentley, for Mrs. Reeser, and for some of the other cases we're going to be describing soon, are so instantaneous that either there is no time for pain signals to be transmitted to the brain, or the process involves something that doesn't even involve the nervous system per se. So that whatever is happening here, and we have this from other sources, word of mouth, because there are survivors of partial spontaneous human combustion, they don't experience anything remotely akin to the kind of pain that one would expect at a fire scene like this. So to allay your concerns, Paul, whatever took down Dr. Bentley, we'll put some money on the table that it was not painful to him.
I mean, that, and then the fact that they, they don't have any kind of reports of anybody screaming or from within, inside. Because you would think you catch on fire, the first thing you're just like, holy, I'm on fire,
Yeah.
But nothing, they don't hear anything, stuff like that. You would hope that it's just instant and they're just gone. But whew, yeah, it's still, just to think about it. Yeah, so we'll jump on.
It's Halloween. This is something that this is a good subject for any Halloween discussion.
Absolutely.
It's bizarre, it's weird, it's scary, it's frightening, it's gruesome, and yet at the same time, at least for us and a few of our colleagues, it is so damnably fascinating. How does this happen?
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're going to jump into this next one here. Let's take a look.
Okay. This is the fire scene that took down Beatrice Oski, another case that we broke to the world, devoted chapter in our book Ablaze to her amazing fatality, her transition from this world to another. This happened Thanksgiving weekend 1979 in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a wealthy suburb southwest of Chicago. We were at this fire scene. We spoke to Mrs. Oski's son. We spoke to the fire marshal and the fire chief in Bolingbrook, both of whom at the time were utterly mystified and bumfuddled by this fire scene. It was initially discovered about 12, if memory serves, around 12:25 p.m. On Thanksgiving weekend by Mrs. Oski's daughter-in-law, who had stopped by the house to retrieve some items. She looked down. This is a split level home. When she entered the front door and looked down to the lower level, she thought she saw a chair fire. And if you look at another picture that we did not provide that shows an overview, indeed, it looks exactly like a chair fire. She called the fire department. Bolingbrook Fire Department arrived a few minutes later to find a fire scene for which there was no fire to put out. The firefighters approached what they thought was a chair fire. They discovered that in the chair was a human body and the remains, obviously, of Mrs. Oski, who, if memory serves, was 51 years of age at the time. She was a known smoker. So, the skeptics say, well, she dropped a cigarette in her lap and, careless smoking accident, too bad for her. Well, once again, there is some amount of body tissue left. Obviously, the two lower legs are intact. She was semi-invalidic, as was Dr. Bentley. In this case, Mrs. Oski used a leg brace on her left leg. There's a fair amount of body tissue left in this case, enough that actually an autopsy could be worked up. Forensics was done on her. And here's something interesting that was found in the forensics workup. There was not a drop of blood left in any part of her remains. We're puzzled by that.
Almost like an accelerant.
Yeah. Except no accelerant was found at the fire scene.
Yeah.
Clocks in Mrs. Oski's home had stopped at about 12:15. And initially the fire marshal told us, well, this happened at 12:15 a.m. She had about 12 hours to consume herself. So, maybe it could be a smoking accident, maybe, but he was still really skeptical of that. And in fact, the fire chief, Mr. Dugan, told us it looked like she'd been hit by the afterburner of a jet engine. I mean, he had been to structure fires, chemical fires, where the heat he knew was incredibly intense. And yet he thought that in Mrs. Oski's house, the temperatures of the fire must have been even hotter than an industrial chemical fire. And yet there was almost no surrounding damage. The fire, again, is very localized, as it was in Dr. Bentley's case, as it was in Mary Reeser's case. You can see her telephone cord is distended a bit by the heat. There's some very minor heat damage to the credenza next to her chair. Just beyond the credenza was a sofa with a plastic slipcover on it that did not heat the store at any extent. Her stockings are intact, not discolored by heat or flame. And she had a pink woven afghan nearby that's intact. And we pointed out to the fire marshal and the fire chief in Bolingbrook as we sat down with them and went over a batch of photographs and their recollections and their fire records for this event, that maybe the fire didn't start at 12:15 a.m. when the clock stopped, but the clock stopped at 12:15 p.m., which meant that her daughter-in-law arrived 10 minutes after this event happened. Right. In support of that supposition is our belief that on the sofa is a copy of the Chicago Tribune, which we believe is from the day that this fire happened, which meant that Mrs. Oskey had gone outdoors to bring in that daily paper, which would not have happened at 12:15 a.m., would have happened sometime late in the morning or maybe even early afternoon. So we're pretty much convinced that this is a very short duration fire, though we cannot prove that, but probably it happened within a span of 15 minutes. Again, no noxious odor of burned flesh. There is minor, very minor heat damage to the ceiling directly above the chair. But the first responders whom we interviewed initially all said to us that they have no way to explain this fire scene in terms that they know from their fire service education and fire service training. This fire scene lies outside of what they have been trained to expect when they get a fire call.
Man, that's definitely odd. The fact, so I guess would that be like the chair that's behind, looks like arms sticking out? That would be like the
yeah,
chair.
That's the back of the chair. Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Good observation.
Man, yeah, it looks like she melted down all the way. Yeah, it's crazy. Oof. Well, let's jump into the next oddity here.
Another case that we discovered, documented thoroughly. In fact, this may be the best photographically documented case that fits the definition of spontaneous human combustion that has yet occurred. Victim is George Mott in the insert. Ironically, a firefighter in upstate New York, in the little village of Crown Point outside Ticonderoga. He lived in this 800 square foot wood frame structure, again, a tinderbox of an environment. If there would have been any significant fire inside the structure, the entire structure should have burned to the ground. Very combustible environment. Right. We got tipped off to this case in the spring of 1986. Tony Moret was the Essex County fire investigator. He was perplexed. We got together with him and he said, Larry, I've got a mystery. Come on up. I've heard about your research. I think you're going to be interested in this case. Come up and let's see what we can figure out together. Our team went up. We spent between ourselves and Tony about 750 man hours documenting this fire scene. It's astonishing. George Mott's son, Kendall, had not heard from his dad in about 2 days. Kendall went out to check on his dad one evening in late March 1986. And as soon as Kendall walked in the front door, he realized that something was amiss. He didn't go further. He called a neighbor who went in and came back and said, Kendall, your dad's died in a fire. Fire department arrived. Again, no fire for them to put out. This is one of the fire photographs that was taken by Tony Moret. He unfortunately was not a great fire photographer. It's a little out of focus. He was, however, a superb fire investigator. We've never met anyone that we would consider outshines Tony as a field fire investigator. Great man, great questions, great inquisitiveness. He tried to figure this one out and he couldn't. When we teach this subject at the college level here in Harrisburg at the community college, we ask the students every year if they can identify for us the human body part that is in Dr. Bentley's, I'm sorry, in George Mott's bed. They cannot find it. We can't point it out on screen to you, but we'll try to, I'm sure your viewers can't find it either, so here we go. The body part that George left behind, aside from a shrunken head, according to the first responders, at the head of the bed, was one half of one leg lying on the V shape of the mattress. If you look where the V in the mattress is deepest, that's where you're going to find his lower right leg. You can see in that gap between the slightly chinged baseboard of the bed and the deepest V in the mattress, slight flesh-colored little things there. Those are his toes.
Like right here?
You got it right there. You're right on it. Excellent. Good, Paul. That's it. Lower right leg severed just below the kneecap. Everything else in Mr. Mott's bed, or everything in Mr. Mott's body, had burned through the mattress and been reduced to dry calcined powder that burned through the floorboards below the bed and into the crawl space underneath the flooring. Tony Moret, the Essex County fire investigator, shoveled up those ashes, collected the head and the leg. We talked later to the medical examiner for the county and said, is this all you got? He said, yeah, everything we got from the Mott fire scene that was thought to be his body, aside from his leg, we could put in a shoebox, and we did. Well, you can't put a normal-sized human head in a normal-sized shoebox. It's too big.
Right.
Shoebox won't close. So that's further testimony to us that what the first responders, Tony Moret, said was a shrunken head about the size of a grapefruit, he told us, is indeed true. Again, not supposed to happen in any high heat fire scene. Sweet aroma was present again. We were at this fire scene, as we said. We stood beside this bed. No fire damage, no heat damage whatsoever to the ceiling above the bed. You're not going to get a convection plume of heat at this fire scene because there's no evidence, no proof for such. This is an extraordinary, complicated, and confusing fire scene. We have documented every room in George Mott's house. There was attendant heat damage elsewhere in the house, most often affecting hydrocarbon type plastics. Fly swatters had melted off walls off their wire holders. In Mr. Mott's kitchen, we discovered cookies that looked like they had been baked on a paper plate. Inside his refrigerator, which was operating at the time, first responders found a dish of butter that had melted inside that refrigerator. Also, the medical examiner told us that he found a package of hot dogs that looked as though they had been parboiled. So there's some kind of heat energy at Mott's tinderbox of a house, doing weird stuff, vaporizing water in the bathtub and the toilet, we believe, leaving a caramel-colored layer of baked-on soot on horizontal surfaces throughout the house. Mr. Mott was a curious individual. In his library collection was a book that contained a chapter about, believe it or not, spontaneous human combustion. We have that book. The book cover has been analyzed, and the analysis suggests that there's some kind of a nuclear event that happened here. Not an oxidizing type of fire combustion, but something very, very different.
That's odd that whatever causes that melting in the fridge of all places. Was there any kind of documentation of maybe like footsteps leaving any kind of heat or any kind of melting on the floor? Maybe that could explain, maybe he was in the kitchen and he ran to the bathroom or ran to the bed.
Yeah, great question. No, we look for such evidence. And let us go beyond that now, because you've triggered some memories, some other things. George Mott did have some respiratory issues. He had next to his bed, not shown in this photograph, but we do have photographs of it, he had an oxygen enrichment device standing next to the bed that was connected through a plastic hose to a faceplate that he used to help him breathe when he went to bed at night. That oxygen enrichment machine, which would provide additional oxygen, which is supposedly would have created a more intense fire combustion. You like to have oxygen for an oxidizing type of fire. The oxygen enrichment machine was running when Dr. Bentley, when George Mott's body was discovered. The plastic hose lying on the machine itself, which was literally inches from this fire scene, that plastic hose was intact. It had not been damaged, which suggests like almost no heat.
Right.
Creates really, really significant problems. It's argued that George Mott had maybe ignited his garments in an adjoining room, walked in and laid down on the bed, and met his final demise here. We find no evidence of that whatsoever. The BCI, the Bureau of Criminal Investigations in New York, looked into this and decided, oh, this has a really easy explanation. This is an electrical mishap where an electrical arc had shorted out through one of the outlets behind Mr. Mott's bed, caught the mattress on fire, and incinerated the hapless sleeping gentleman. Well, both we and Tony Moret tore apart every outlet in the bedroom. There is no evidence whatsoever of electrical arcing in any of the outlets. George Mott did not smoke. At this time, he had not smoked for years. As a retired firefighter, we were told by people who knew him that he was fiercely concerned about, and one could almost say deathly afraid of fire. He was meticulous in his house regarding anything that might have been a fire hazard. So we rule out, based on that evidence, as well as physical examination of property on site, that there was no known identifiable external ignition source that it could have caused this fire to ignite within his body. Remember, we said earlier, one of the reasons that spontaneous human combustion is dismissed by mainstream fire science and forensic biologists in particular is that there is no known case, they say, in which internal organs of the victim are burned more severely than our outer external body parts. Therefore, the fire has to burn from outside within. Well, in Bentley's case, as we've already demonstrated, and now in the George Mott case, there are no internal organs left. They're disintegrated, they're powder. We do have the external body part in both the cases of Dr. Bentley and George Mott. We have that lower part of the leg. So we do have an external body part here, but the internal body parts are gone. They're disintegrated. They're powder. They're dry powder. You do not find that in a normal fire fatality fire scene, but you do find it in a case like this, which again meets historically the definition and the concept for spontaneous human combustion. It may look like there was a lot of damage done to the bed baseboard here. That charring is very shallow. We could punch our fingernail into that and not penetrate to the tip of the skin of our thumb. There's a very shallow burn damage to that wood. Again, no fire damage overhead, no electrical arcing from the outlets. So what caused it? How did it happen?
That's definitely that's the $1 million question. I mean, you mentioned nuclear findings. Did that ever amount into anything, or it was just kind of a light, like a light read?
The mathematics and the theorizing are very solid, we believe. There's no way at this point to test this in a laboratory. We did apply independently another avenue of investigation to theorize how these cases might be explained in terms of something that happens at the quantum level. And We applied quantum theory, quantum mechanics to this, and we came up with the postulation for a really, 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 really tiny particle that we've dubbed the pyrotron, wavelength of about 10 to the minus 31 centimeters, which is by a factor of at least 10 smaller than any other particle presently known to mainstream physics.
Right.
Such a particle has a tremendous amount of energy, at 10 to the 27 ergs. When we shared this with some college level physics instructors, they first poo-pooed this as, nah, that's not possible. And we went through the math with them. They couldn't dispute the math and said, well, maybe it could be. That's really interesting, Larry. I'll have to think about that more. We have been rebuked to no end by the naysayers that we've created this hypothetical, well, it is hypothetical, but this bizarre, stupid thing called a pyrotron to explain these cases. It's a theory. We can't prove it. Nobody in science as yet has the technology to prove the existence of a particle this small. But your body, our body, the bodies of your entire audience, whenever they view this, are being targeted by billions of neutrinos. They're so small they zip right through the atomic structure in your body. To our knowledge, to science knowledge, that doesn't produce any particularly hazardous impact. They just zip through. They're so small.
Right.
Pyrotron's even smaller, but the catch is it's got a huge amount of energy. Quantum mechanics demands that a particle so small to produce this kind of damage to a body has to have a lot of energy. If that really small pyrotron hits a cork in your body, it's going to release a tremendous amount of energy instantaneously, enough to vaporize, dehydrate, break down the water molecules in your body. And that's one theory that we've posited in our book Ablaze to explain perhaps a reasonable trajectory for understanding better these amazing fire scenes. As we said, we can't prove it. It's a theory, but it's certainly worthy of consideration. We submit.
Absolutely. Well,
you have to think outside the box for these fires.
Yeah,
that's really outside the box. We'll give it to you, but we're not willing to rule out too much at this point. It's an open mystery.
Yeah, I definitely got a lot of out of the box ideas as well. It's definitely nothing that you could take to anybody with any kind of experience, and like you mentioned, scientists and such that kind of poo-poo the idea, like you said. So,
and when you're dealing with firefighters, most firefighters aren't into quantum mechanics, so you're really, you're asking them to stretch their thinking quite considerably.
Yeah, no, definitely. I doubt that my friend who I've known all my life pretty much is some kind of quantum scientist on the side, as well. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely.
Remind us later if you want to, Paul, to discuss the cartography of combustion. That's really another interesting theory, but let's go through a couple more cases with your audience for right now.
Jump in here.
Tell you what, can you go one ahead of that?
Yeah.
Then we'll come back to that one. Okay. Another case that we take credit for discovering and bringing to the global attention. We sat on this case for many years. It is fully documented in our book Ablaze. People say that, Larry, you're making this stuff up. You have no background in fire science. You don't know what you're looking at. You don't understand fire behavior. Yes, we do. As well as some professional firefighters, we will submit humbly. We are one of only a few, and we may have been the only non-professional firefighter to have been granted access to attend an advanced arson course at the Pennsylvania Fire Academy shortly after we began doing our research. In that class, at the end of the class, the instructor, Buzz Trebold, mentioned that he had just received a set of photographs of a case that some people would say was spontaneous human combustion. Localized fire, lady sitting in a chair, yada, yada, yada. We turned to one of the professional firefighters sitting next to us and said, oh yeah, that's got to be the research case. Let me tell you a little about that while the fire photograph gets circulated through the classroom. Boy, were we knocked down. When that photograph got into our hands, we looked at it, which is this photograph, and said, shit, that's not Mary Reeser. That's a case we know nothing about.
Yeah.
We rushed up at the end of the class to buzz people and said, typical questions: who, when, where, how, what. He said, I don't know. All I know is that this fire scene happened somewhere in southeastern Pennsylvania. Well, guess what? Southeastern Pennsylvania is Philadelphia and the surrounding suburbs, the most populous area of our home state. Millions of people lived down there. We had no name, we had no date, we had no jurisdiction, we had nothing but this photograph. How do we find it? It took us 9 months. We nailed it. We found the fire department, we found the address, we found the name of the victim. This is Helen A. Conway, age 49 when she met her flaming fate in Upper Darby Township outside of Philadelphia in 1964, if memory serves. This is the home. The insert is her house. She lived on the second floor. Here's the brief story. Sunday morning, November 1964, she asked her granddaughter Stephanie to fetch her a pack of cigarettes. The understanding is that Stephanie brought the cigarettes back to her grandmother and then went back downstairs to watch television on a Sunday morning. Very shortly thereafter, a passerby outside the home noticed smoke coming from a second floor window. This person was a neighbor of Mrs. Oski, tried to break into the house, unsuccessful at first. Fire department was called, arrived very quickly to a fire scene. Knowing that the fire was upstairs, they took their equipment upstairs, down the hallway, opened the door. The room was filled with dense black smoke. Could not see anything. They thought Mrs. Conway was in there somewhere. One firefighter went in on his hands and knees with his arm outstretched, probing around, trying to find Mrs. Conway's body. He put it in something he did not know what. When the crew brought in the smoke ejectors and the smoke was extricated, he realized that he had just put his hand in the center of Mrs. Conway's ashened body above the point where her two legs were exposed. We were told that it was a long time before that firefighter was willing to go back to another fire scene. Really disturbing. Facts of the case. Clearly, once again, incredible destruction to the body. The two lower legs up to the knees are intact. Deep burn laceration in her upper thighs. This photo does not show it, but from a different angle, you can actually see the lower end of her jawbone. She has been blown back, pushed back with force, that appears to us, breaking down the back of her chair. Paul, if you're really good at this, on her, above her right kneecap, you will see a shiny bell-shaped object. Yep, perfect, you're good. She was invalidic. She used that bell to summon assistance and probably rang that bell a few minutes before this photograph was taken to summon Stephanie to get her a pack of cigarettes. The bell has a wooden handle. The pine handle on that bell would burn at 507 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right.
The bell handle is intact. On her left wrist, which is burned to the bone, dangles a metal charm bracelet, which would melt at fairly low temperature. It's intact. You can see her telephone is largely intact. I think the plastic would have melted below 700 degrees Fahrenheit. Lampshade has either been removed or was never there to begin with. There's no evidence that it was burned away. There is evidence of spalling on the wall behind her. Fire experts tell us that that burn pattern tells them that this was an extremely high heat fire, if it was an oxidizing combustion. No damage to the ceiling. No odor of burned flesh. No odor at all, the first responders whom we interviewed have told us. Slight charring on the edge of the table to the right of her chair.
Is this piece of
Problem
the
in
chair
itself.
missing right here? Is this burnt right here? Is this missing?
Yeah, you can, if you're right where you're, go up to, just go to the right of the, go to the left of the bell. Yeah, right there. That's the right arm of her chair.
Okay.
Difficult to see in this photograph. A different angle shows it much better. There is still smoke coming from the upholstery material on the arm of her chair. So it's clear that there was little time elapsed between when this fire actually progressed through her body until the time that the fire crew arrived to find a fire they did not need to put out. Now, skeptics say that these are slow heat, smoldering fires over a long duration, which they attribute to something they call the Human Wick effect. If you go online on YouTube, you'll see lots of excerpts from various television programs that we have appeared on talking about spontaneous human combustion. The naysayers always invoke this idea, this concept of the human wick, which is basically that the human body becomes an inverted inside-out candle, where the clothing of the victim is the wick. It ignites, creates enough heat to start to burn the adipose fatty tissue in the victim's body, i.e. the outside of the candle. Doesn't produce a lot of heat, but it does require a whole lot of time, because it's a low heat smoldering combustion, they argue, to incinerate a body to this extent. We have two counters to that. First, in Texas, there are a lot of crematorium operators, as there are throughout the country. Crematorium operation is a business. Crematorium owners provide a service, but they do so also with the expectation of making a fair, reasonable profit. It is a business. They're going to conduct their business in the most economically efficient way possible. Rather than spend $100,000 on all that equipment that we showed you earlier, if the Wick theory works to explain these kinds of fire scenes that we're sharing and describing to you in this program, why would not a crematorium owner, rather than spend $100,000 on equipment, permits, zoning issues, and a lot of fuel oil and natural gas, simply buy a pack of cigarettes and for a couple pennies, light a cigarette, lay it on the cadaver, his customer, so to speak, walk away, have a leisurely lunch, a couple martinis perhaps, come back and find a pile of dry powder that he could scrape into an urn and give to the next of kin. If they could do that, they would be doing that.
Yeah.
They don't do that because, as that fire chief in New Jersey told us, who operates a crematorium, as Dr. Krogman told us many years ago when we sat down face to face with him to discuss the Greaser case, and scores of other fire officials and crematorium operators that we've had the privilege to interview over the course of our investigations, they know they can't do that. That's argument one. Here's argument two. Let's go back to the previous slide now. In the Conway case, we sat down with Fire Chief Haggerty, the Assistant Fire Marshal, and the fire photographer who later became Fire Marshal for Upper Darby Township, Bob Meslin. We discussed this case with Bob Meslin at great length, both in correspondence and sitting down with him at his kitchen table in Upper Darby. Here's the letter that Bob Meslin wrote to us about the time factor in the Conway case. And this is vitally important because it blows the hell off the proponents of the human wick theory. Said Bob Meslin, the amazing part of the incident, in my opinion, is the time element. The granddaughter at the time is reported to have said that a few minutes before the discovery of the fire, her grandmother had asked her to get her a pack of cigarettes, which she did, going down. He determined that the maximum length of time for Mrs. Conway to have consumed to the extent that she did is 21 minutes, including the time for the photographs. As he said, that leaves a lot to think about. Now, as we sat down with him at his kitchen table with his letter in our hand, we questioned the time element. 21 minutes included the time it took for him to take the photographs. Here's where it gets really, really interesting. Bob Meslin was called, he arrived with the first responders. When Chief Haggerty saw what the fire scene was after the smoke had been ejected, he said, Meslin, go back home, get your camera and back here and take some pictures. This is important. Meslin left the fire scene, went to his house, got his camera, came back, and took a dozen photographs. We know the time when the last photograph was taken. Crunch the time it took him to take the photographs, to have left the fire scene, get the camera, and return. Subtract that from 21 minutes, which includes the time for him to take those photographs. And we were down to 360 seconds from the time that Mrs. Conway was believed to be alive and in good health until the fire department arrived to a fire they did not have to put out. That's 6 minutes. Nobody, including the most staunchest detractor that we have, says that he can explain this degree of destruction to a human body in 6 minutes by any known fire source. Never mind the fact that there's no odor of burned flesh, no heat or flame damage above the chair in which Mrs. Conway met her demise. It appears to us in all the photographs that we have in our possession, and to our knowledge, we have the only complete extent set of fire photographs of this remarkable fire scene that Bob took. It appears to us from debris pattern that more likely Mrs. Conway simply didn't spontaneously combust. She spontaneously exploded, which is just a more rapid form of combustion. Whatever happened to her remains, in our view, and should remain in the view of any honest observer, a mystery to this day. However she met her flaming fate, she took that mystery to her grave.
Yeah, I mean, it would support, the fact that you said that it looked like she was blown back in her chair. So that would, that would definitely insinuate some kind of explosion of,
In most of the classic cases, and these are classic cases of spontaneous human combustion, it appears that the origin of the energy and the quote unquote fire, air quotes here, the fire is in the torso, the lower abdominal area of the body. And whatever that energy is that starts there expands outward and beyond a small radius, beyond the human fireball radius of this energy. Whatever is beyond that radius escapes significant destruction. So we have, in this case, from the kneecaps down, her legs are intact. Very minor damage to the table, both tables flanking the sides of her chair. But there's a lot of force here, which we believe pushed her body back and broke down the back of the chair. Similar fire scene we find in the Oski case. In Dr. Bentley's case, that force was directed downwards, so his body literally augured its way through his bathroom floor. If any of your audience has an alternative explanation or ideas to refute the mystery and explain these cases, we are eager to hear from them. Believe us. On the other hand, if they find these fires as mysterious and baffling as we believe them to be, let us know that too.
Yeah, let us know. Let us know something, because we're all in the same boat. I have no explanation that would be considered anywhere remotely close to the answer. All of mine are kind of out there, nothing to do with,
One of our major detractors, when we discussed this case with him, said, well, there's just got to be something else we don't know about this case. And his implication was that the time factor was wrong. Well, most of the family members had gone to church that morning, so they'd been home, maybe 7:30 in the morning. Had Mrs. Conway been smoldering normally upstairs, they would have smelled something suspicious and would have investigated. It's beyond our comprehension that she would have smoldered for 12 hours slowly overnight.
Right.
Everything speaks to something very quick and within that 6-minute time frame. So yes, we'll agree with our detractor that there's something we don't know about this case, but it's not the time element. It's the mechanism and the energy at this fire scene that we don't know about. And therein lies a mystery yet to be solved. When this photograph was handed to Dr. Lester Adelson, who was a medical examiner for Cuyahoga County in Ohio, who had written many years earlier an article debunking SHC, he was handed this photograph, and we'll never forget his reaction to it. He said, "This is a hoax. This photograph is a hoax. It's not real. Ask why," he said, "because bodies don't burn this way," quote unquote. Yes, Dr. Adelson, they do burn this way.
I was going to say, is there a special way that bodies should be burning all, this whole time? Is there like a set way that we're not aware of, that when you catch on fire, that's how you're supposed to burn? I mean, that's definitely a cop-out answer. I just didn't want to have to go into it any deeper than that. So,
yep.
Well, that's that's definitely odd. It's crazy.
This is an interesting case, and if there are any naysayers still tuned into this, you say, well, Larry's full of crap and he doesn't understand what's going on, and yes, I can replicate this in a reconstructed fire scene. If you can do that, let us know. We've done firework in burn chambers, and man, we can't replicate this. We've tried to we've tested the Wick theory multiple times, and every effort has met with humorously fascinating failure. It just doesn't work. But this one's really interesting. If you can duplicate this in a laboratory, have at us, man, because we want to see it done. This is an etching taken from a photograph that was made in 1888 in Aberdeen, Scotland. The case was written up in the British Medical Journal by Dr. J. Mackenzie Booth. He characterized it as a state of what he called spontaneous ignition, analogous to spontaneous human combustion. The body of this gentleman, Mr. Albert Minster, identified in the literature only as Mr. A.M., was found in a hayloft in Aberdeen, Scotland in February of 1888. You can make out the head in the upper right corner, the torso. You can go down and see his two legs in the left side of the etching. There's some white things on his chest. We think those are shingles, or maybe he was covering himself up in newspaper. We're not sure about that. We're still trying to get the photograph. But the interesting thing here is that while the body looks to be intact and looks kind of like that first photograph that we showed you of a normally burned, severe fourth-degree burn injury, the body appears to be intact, but it was discovered lying atop straw that itself had not burned. And most interestingly, when the rescuers of Mr. Minster tried to remove the body from the hayloft, the body crumbled to powder in their hands, according to Dr. Booth. Now, we have yet to discover anywhere in the fire service literature or in discussions with any of the hundreds of professional firefighters whom we've interviewed over the decades, a case where a body maintains its structure, its anatomical structure, and yet is totally, completely dehydrated, so that when touched, it collapses to an amorphous pile of powder. That's what happened in this case. If one can duplicate this with these conditions in a laboratory in an attempt to debunk spontaneous human combustion, good luck. We want to see the test. We want to see that experiment.
It's kind of like what I can liken it to when I used to, unfortunately, smoke for a lot of years. But when we smoke a cigarette and the ash just kind of obviously burns from the inside, and then at the end of the cigarette, if like the slightest touch and it's just gone into powder and stuff like that,
That's a metaphor.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking of. Is there? Don't smoke. Nobody smoke. It's a bad habit. Yeah, that one's definitely, the fact that he was laying on that hay bale and then there was no burn to it, no fire on it or something like that. That's
So
mysterious.
call it spontaneous ignition, call it spontaneous human combustion, call it sudden human cremation, or call it super hypothermic caramelization, as we've done in connection with the pyrotron theory. Whatever you want to call it, these cases exist. The photographic evidence and documentation is real. The first responders whom we have interviewed on case after case after case tell us basically the same story. Total human incineration of a very localized nature, suggesting incredible temperatures for which there is no surrounding evidence. Often that sweet redolent smell, no noxious odor of burned flesh. We keep seeing the same parameters again and again and again, albeit infrequently. So we believe there's a real mystery here, a real combustion conundrum to discuss. Historically, this has been witnessed. What the witnesses report is most often seen a bright electric blue colored fire or flame originating from within the human body. Sometimes we have reports of an argent colored flame, um, more characteristic a blue-red flame, which would be indicative of a lower heat. But most often the witnessed accounts talk about this very bright blue colored fire, like you would see at the tip of a lit acetylene torch. Should provide some clues. We're still trying to ponder out what would be the nature of the energy that would produce that color. And we think the pyrotron, something that causes almost complete dissociation of the water content of the human body, is a likely avenue to pursue further. In fact, we have a witness case. One of those witness cases comes from a fire brigade commander in London, in Lambeth in 1974, correction, 67. Jack Stacey and his crew were called to a fire scene where a derelict was discovered on the ground floor of a part of an abandoned building. Jack told us that he and his crew saw in the gut of the victim, already deceased, a bright blue-colored jet of fire emanating from his abdomen with force, his words, with force. To extinguish that blaze required, he told us, the contents of several fire extinguishers. And then they all left scratching their heads. We sat down with Jack Stacey and interviewed him at length about this case. As we said to him, we wish that in hindsight, he and his crew would have let the fire proceed naturally to its natural conclusion to see exactly would the whole body have eventually incinerated to powder, because Mr. Bailey, the victim, was already deceased. But that didn't happen, so we don't know what the end result would have been, other than that there was a fire crew and a fire brigade commander in London who was completely bumfuddled.
Right. Yeah, obviously. No, definitely I'm left with more questions than anything else. I mean, I wish I could be like, oh, I know exactly what it is, but I have no idea. I mean, it's all different cases. It's
Unlike some of our colleagues who assert that we're omniscient and should know better, we've never claimed omniscience. There is so much in this amazing world that needs to be studied and needs to be understood. This is just one small niche area, but we truly believe that the work that we've done does provide the evidence for a serious reconsideration of the effects of fire, and in a broader sense, the effects of energy generally on the human body.
Right. Now, you mentioned that you actually teach classes on this. Is this like classes at the university, or how does that work for you guys?
We have taught for the last 20 some years fire science at the Harrisburg Area Community College on a guest basis. The instructor, Don Conkle, who used to be the fire chief here in Harrisburg, knows our research. thinks we've got a lot of information that deserves to be examined by people in the fire service industry, and it's been gracious to have us come in every year and lecture to his class. And the response has been really intriguing. Sometimes we have the students, some of whom are professional firefighters, some are volunteer firefighters, some are EMT personnel. We've had an insurance adjuster come in 1 year, and because they deal with fire, death, fire injuries, having to pay out claims.
Right.
Response is all over the board. Sometimes we have a class where we could be talking to a wall. There's no feedback, no questions, no apparent interest at all. Versus the other extreme where they come up and want to see more photographs. They throw ideas at us. They throw observations, as you've made tonight, Paul, some really cogent observations about some of these photographs. Looking for details and saying that doesn't make any sense. How could that have happened? Why is this here? Why is that not there? Why is there no odor of burned flesh, and so on? All we can hope is that we've touched a chord in some of these students, some of these professional firefighters, that when they go out and perhaps in the course of their further training or in their firefighting careers will come across one of these cases and say, wow, now I know what Larry was talking about back there in 1996, and I know what to look for, and I know who to call, and I'm going to get him out here, and together we're going to try to figure this one out. That sort of happened in 2013. We got wind of a case in Oklahoma that seemed to fit the criteria for classic spawn com. We contacted the county sheriff out there. He said, I know of your work, and frankly, to us, I'm not willing to discount spontaneous human combustion. Come on out. And we met with the fire chief, several fire departments who were involved in that particular case. And we're not going to go into details in that case here, but it does fit all the criteria for classic preternatural and spontaneous human combustion. Incredibly localized fire scene, just as the ones that we've shared with you earlier this evening.
Right.
The phenomenon, as we said, is rare. If it happened many, many times a year, if some of those 2,500 to 2,000 fire fatalities in America every year fit the fire scenes that we've shared with you, this wouldn't be a mystery. It wouldn't be, at least it wouldn't be so easily denied. But because these cases are so infrequent, and because so many of the first responders simply haven't been educated to expect that such a fire scene as what we've shared with you can indeed occur, they're unprepared, they're easily willing to write it off as, a mishap, smoking accident, and let the mystery lie with the ashes.
Right.
We're looking for answers.
Yeah, definitely. Is it just kind of like word of mouth that you guys hear of these things? Or, because I mean, obviously there's not some kind of centralized location where, fire departments all over the country are inputting this, this stuff, especially if certain firehouses, don't want to even touch it. So, I mean, is it just kind of, you get reports or you hear of things? Is that how that works?
That's pretty much how it works. Yeah, with the advent of the internet, it makes things a little easier. We have a network of fellow researchers around the world who know of our particular interest in this niche phenomena. So when they hear about an odd fire, possibly odd fire in their area, they kindly alert us to it, and then we pursue it from there. We've got a fire departments and introduce ourselves and our research. If there's any interest at all expressed, we certainly leave our business card with them and say, should you hear of a case in your own jurisdiction, or if you go to a fire convention, a fire symposium, and one of your colleagues you hear through the grapevine had a case, pass it back to us and we'll follow up on it. The more information we can garner, the more facts and details that we can amass, clearly the easier it's going to be to someday come up with a plausible solution that maybe even can be tested in the laboratory.
Right.
But we're still pursuing the gathering of that information. In our book, we discuss some 120 different theories, none of which at this point can be proven in a laboratory. So it's all speculation at this point, other than the fact, as we will assert again, that these cases do occur, they are real, They're not hoaxes. They're not superstition. It's not Larry Arnold mystery mongering something to get himself on your podcast.
Right. No, we're not big enough anyways. Yeah, but it's, I mean, yeah, it's all, I mean, definitely have extra ears down here now. I mean, I'm in Central Texas, and like I mentioned, I have a buddy of mine is way down South Texas. So if we hear anything, we'll definitely shoot something over as well. But
Fantastic.
yeah, so there's that. And I mean, yeah, so I guess we can kind of close out on, for anybody that's actually wanting to get the book as well, just let them know how they can do that again, and how they can reach out to you. So you can go to parascience.com, and you can go ahead and write to Larry as well. You can find the book as well on Amazon, if you guys want to do it that way as well. And you guys have like any kind of social media or anything like Facebook or anything where anybody can get a hold of you guys as well?
We do have Facebook. We're not active on social media, as we explained to you earlier, but we do have a Facebook page, so you can probably track us down, Larry Arnold. Type in spontaneous human combustion, and somewhere along the line, we're going to pop up in a Google search.
Right. Yeah, you're definitely all over there. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and track those links down as well. Like I mentioned for everybody, we'll go ahead and link everything down in the show notes as well, so that you guys have all those links. But I just wanted to go ahead and say thank you, Mr. Larry Arnold, for your time and definitely sharing all these interesting cases with us. It's like I mentioned before, we're definitely left with a lot more questions than anything else. And that's a good thing. So we'll definitely definitely. We'll definitely be keeping an eye out as well, like I mentioned. And if we hear of anything, we'll go ahead and shoot those cases on over to you guys as well, so you can go ahead and look into them a little deeper.
Cannot ask for more than that. Open-mindedness is key to getting this mystery and a lot of other Fortean mysteries resolved and understood. We have thoroughly enjoyed this. You've been a treasure to work with tonight. We hope your viewers, those who take advantage of your podcast, will have found this as fascinating and enjoyable as we've had the pleasure of working with you tonight.
Absolutely. We appreciate it. And for everybody else out there, really appreciate you guys stopping by. I just want to give a quick shout out. I know we've been picking up new listeners all around the place, all around the world as well. For anybody that's been tracking with us for about the past month or so, we've been picking up a lot of different viewers all over the world. So the latest ones that we have here are for everybody that's listening to us in Kuwait. We really appreciate you guys as well. Sweden, Singapore, and Japan. We picked you guys up in the last couple of weeks as well. So we really appreciate you guys stopping in and listening to the podcast as well. Like I mentioned before, if you guys are listening to this episode in particular, you're going to want to go ahead and jump on our YouTube page and check out the images that go along with the cases as well. So yeah, you want to go ahead and take advantage of that as well. For everybody else, if you guys are watching this on YouTube, like I mentioned before, go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you're not already a subscriber, as well as that bell icon. If you're on the go, like I mentioned, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, as well as iHeartRadio at Truth Defender Podcast. All our social media will be linked down below for you guys. If you have any questions or comments for myself or our guest or topic recommendations, you can find us at thetruthDefender1776@gmail.com. We really appreciate you guys stopping in, and we'll catch you guys on the next episode. Everybody stay safe out there, stay blessed, and stay frosty.